Welcome to AI Salon. Today we have Christina Hsiang. Christina, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I've been in the Bay Area as a corporate attorney, so working on venture capital financing, some M&A, and so various commercial transactions with tech companies for 8 or so years, and that has also evolved. And at one point I was building a community connecting corporate venture investors here with corporate venture investors in Southeast Asia, because of just how much technology was changing the business world, and I had access to that in Silicon Valley. And we were getting more interest in the tech economy in Asia, and there was just a huge opportunity to educate both sides um, of the economy, and I guess and that through COVID just changed dramatically, and also just sort of with the wave of development in AI and my personal interest in personal growth and kind of developing deeper understanding of the human experience and sharing that with people, like AI became really my primary focus. And then so I've been kind of transitioning into the world of AI ethics and AI policy.
Okay, great. That's
Yes.
a good, yeah, great intro. So that means that your transition into working on AI ethics and AI policy is relatively recent. You
Mhm.
mentioned a few of the points that brought you there, but could you tell us a little bit more about why you think that's the right place for you to be right now?
Why is it the right place for me right now? I think there's still a huge gap between people who kind of straddle these different worlds, which is like um, the law and policy side, and then have a deeper curiosity for technology and how it works, and then also like connecting it with the human experience component. And I think one of the things that I'm working on is really looking at founding a community when we're bringing more knowledge and wisdom from the social sciences, and kind of personal growth and deeper human understanding into how we're thinking about AI ethics and AI policy. So like instead of saying like AI ethics is, let's just figure out what's right and wrong and what are the risks, and looking at from taking a step back and saying like AI is part of the context that human beings live in, part of that larger fabric that's changing and evolving. And that fabric includes, how culture is evolving, how politics is evolving, how the economy is working, and AI is kind of like, permeating that in different ways, some more visible than others. And then given that context, how do we think about living well collectively? And then like that's going to differ, right, depending on what country, what group that we're in. So as opposed to saying that let's figure out what's right or wrong about um, bias, saying like, hey, as a society, like there are values that we have, for our society, and in relation to bias, then how do we then create, whether it's like structures or adjust our existing structures so that we're living well. So I think, and that's something I kind of see um the conversation going more into, trending towards, just like we have these large pending questions that AI is just um, making even more even more essential, or bringing more focus to, just like what is us, what is living well in, what are the values we care about, and then like with the changes in technology, how does that work? So uh, yeah, that's sort of a broad description of it.
Okay,
And yeah.
yeah, let's dig into some of those
Yeah.
points. I think they're
Mhm.
they're interesting points.
Mm.
So one of them is AI is becoming part of the AI is software. And software is part of technology that is already part of the fabric of modern societies increasingly across the world. The number of people who are currently connected to the internet using mobile devices is much larger than it was at any point in history, and that trend seems to be continuing. So you laid out a vision of how we should approach incorporating AI into human experiences and human communities and the broader context. How is that distinct from what's happening now?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think this is where it can get a little difficult because to some extent AI is really accelerating what is happening, or it's like overloading some aspect of the system depending on the problem. So I think like there's a way where it's like when we talk about AI ethics and AI policy, like we have to like pick a couple of different specific issues, and then they might be different depending on the specific issues. But like I think with like the elections coming up, the misinformation, disinformation is an example, which is just like, our um, AI recommendation, of content, has been with us for some time in social media. And and now it's like with generative AI, with LLMs, it's just about like, well, the amount of and the ease of misinformation and disinformation being put into that system is then exploding. So it's not necessarily a distinct issue, but then it's becoming like a really urgent issue or a high impact issue, um, due to the combination of different AI technologies that's been slowly permeating, our everyday lives. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you brought up disinformation as one
Mm.
example. Are there any other top of mind examples of existing systems that you believe AI is going to amplify or is amplifying at the moment?
Systems that, yeah, I feel like that's such a broad question. It's like we probably
Yeah,
could, point to any any system and be like, oh, AI is amplifying in some way. So could you like reframe that a little bit so I can,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to let me reframe that.
Mm,
Um, how can I make this more specific? Is there an instance in the past week
mm.
when you were looking at a news story or some issue that came up in conversation or was related to um, the community building you want to do, and you noticed the impact AI was having?
Um, yeah, well, I think one issue, could be like something that has been happening, but then may become like even more prominent of an issue. And I think it's not getting quite enough attention right now yet. It's just like the idea of um, personality profiling. Like, uh, tech companies have already been able to get a lot of information to create sort of these demographic pools and like what consumer like, what kind of content they like. And now with generative AI, it's like we're inputting, even more moment to moment information about ourselves and like specific language that we use. So it's like, if the tech companies wanted to, they could get a very like specific profile of the population and like what are the fears of people right now, what are the personality profiles, in various population. And then it's like, well, this is, I think, an issue, for example, that is something that's just newer on the horizon. It's like, well, what could, companies and government and people do with that? There's lots of positive things, just like, oh, now we can more effectively analyze, personality traits or our patterns based on, our writings or on conversations with people, at a very fast, easy pace, you know,
Mhm.
what are the, risks of that, and how might people misuse that, right? And then how could we use it in beneficial ways? So I think like that's um, a lot of what has happened with, um, different aspects of AI. It's like figuring out like how does that both enable us and how might it be a risk for us? Yeah.
Sure. So that's a very real issue that
Mm,
because I mean we both have hypothetical futures which use these
mm,
technologies, and we also have the present
yeah.
when we can already see how tech this tech is being used. Um, so I really want to dig into what you think we can do about it.
Hmm.
Because on the one hand, you might imagine a naive policy simply stating that there can be no profiling, that we simply make it impossible for companies to do profiling. But then, of course, then governments do it. Um, I don't know if we have any, what mechanisms could we put in place to prevent governments from doing it? Um, is profiling on the population or individual level ever good? How can it help us rather than hurt us? Like, well, what are your thoughts on those directions?
Yes, yeah. So I think one of the things is that like it kind of is bringing up an issue that's been kind of like latent, or we realize it's a problem, but now that problem is becoming much more serious, which is that what do you do about that? An issue comes up, personality profiling. How do we make a decision about what ethical guidelines or policy to make around it? And I think, part of the issue is that we don't really have great mechanisms for discussing these issues, you know, um, uh, to the complexity and with lots of nuance, right? And get good input from the public, and then actually decide as a society what are the values that, how do we prioritize these different values that we have, and then how do we go about deciding, what trade-offs we're willing to accept. And I feel like that's one of the, most important problems that we have now, and that touches on, any of these AI ethics or tech ethics, tech policy issues that are coming up, and, we're still seeing this, right, with social media, in terms of like, um, you know, the people have certain predispositions, tendencies, and how responsible, what kind of responsibilities do the tech companies have, to the extent that they might um, take advantage of those, tendencies, to get their app or get their tools in the hands of everybody. And then it's like, how do we go about, so that kind of deciding what are the responsibilities of tech companies, um,
Mhm.
is
Well,
is an yeah is a discussion that's like happening on very different levels, but very fragmented, and it's like it's still kind of an unsolved issue, you
yeah,
know?
it very much feels like an unsolved issue.
Yeah.
You brought up social media. That's an interesting case because we can look at the policy that exists for gambling and gambling applications and those that exist for social media and see how different those policies are, even though they bring up many of the same issues of addiction and um, like why is it that we as a like in the United States, for example, we have regulations on the addictiveness of gambling applications, but we have very limited regulations about the addictiveness of social media. Um, and when it comes to AI, these issues get amplified. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about, at least maybe if you don't have specific policy thoughts or recommendations, how might we arrive at some that makes sense?
Yeah, yeah, I think certainly, like, I think with a lot of these issues, the problem is like, we may have various type of opinions, or we read like an interesting article, making one metaphor, to say social media and gambling, and another kind of metaphor and then now with AI technology, we're trying to look at like how social media is regulated and see to what extent we can apply, the problems with social media and how we regulate social media to AI technology. And I think, yeah, the biggest problem is just like, but then a lot of these conversations, they don't come to any conclusion, and it's just kind of like we're having these fragmented conversations, and we're not as a society really deciding on, and I think that's where the gap is now, is where we're not able to, and this is related to the political problem, is like we're how do we talk about our values and how do we come to agreement on it. And I
Okay.
think that's just overall, I think the problem that we're facing,
Hmm.
in ethics and policy right now.
Hmm.
um yeah,
So
yeah,
that
and I
ties
think,
back. Yeah.
yeah, and you're
Sorry.
saying like, what I think, and some of the things that I've been, studying or focus more on is like, which I think can help us with this, is, for example, like systems thinking. And I think, the thought leaders talking about the meta crisis, that movement is also, exploring kind of, uh, exploring this problem. So I can't say that, oh, like we've come up with a magic, solution yet. I think we are, like honing in on the problem and trying to understand how we can go about like, creating a solution for it though. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that ties into a previous point that you brought up.
Hmm.
And correct me if I'm
Hmm.
misstating your point of view, but
Hmm.
you said that you believe that different cultures and different contexts may have different solution points or um, different different answers to these questions. And so, for example, the answer that makes the most sense for Texas may not be the answer that makes the most sense for Singapore, um, in terms of what balances they come to. And so I'm wondering how you square that circle, in terms of there being different trade-offs being made in different cultural contexts, and in the case of pluralistic societies like Singapore or Texas, how how they resolve the problem of having multiple different subcultures and different answers even within themselves.
Yeah. It's fascinating because I think, these are like active problems that we're going to be, wrestling with for a while. So there's not going to be, a easy answer, to any of those questions. And I think, and this is where, um, uh, yeah, I think, that, different regions and different countries, or potentially even, states, given the U.S. is, form of government, right, is going to set, different, policies on these different on these issues, just like, with social media, content is regulated differently, say in, like you were saying, in Singapore or India, depending on what's a ripe, political problem or issue, controversial issues, for each of those, demographics, than say here in the US. So that's something that, is, something that, tech companies now have to take into consideration. And then I think, on the legal side, corporate policy also, like that's also a developing, field of a lot of different issues. So for example, like, yes, everybody is, watching for sort of sweeping, changes and sweeping frameworks like the EU, AI Act, but, at least in the US, there is going to be a lot of more targeted, regulatory, guidelines or rulemaking, from different, regulatory agencies. So like the FTC just, had, I think this last week, issued a warning saying if you're gonna change your terms of service secretly so that you can use people's data for AI training, like uh, this could be considered deceptive business practices in the FTC's eyes. So they're definitely are actively, monitoring different issues. And I think one of the problems that we have with, AI ethics and policy right now is just that like the worlds are, and this is not new, but the worlds are really separate, and we have these different regulatory agencies that are looking at specific issues because there are many issues, and then they're not going to all be, same solutions, all that. Um, and then how do we stay on top of it? So that's going to be hard, for tech
Yeah.
startups, in this area, and there are opportunities that because of these communication gaps or fragmentation that is hurting our ability to come up with solutions. So I was just on the FTC website recently, and I was seeing, oh, they issued like a voice cloning challenge in January, right, to seek for solutions on maybe fraud or potential risk related to voice cloning. And they're looking at businesses that might, or AI that's impersonating individuals. How do you go about um, making, so they're currently contemplating rules to govern that. But I think a lot of tech people who might be, say, a startup looking at, creating, uh, like you can, I'm just like making this up on the spot,
Okay.
maybe a startup that's like, oh, we want to allow people to impersonate these celebrities so they can create, comedic content, right, in these voices with these faces, right? Like they may not be aware of all the regulatory things that are happening, even though it is pertinent to them. Um,
Hmm.
and that's just looking at one regulatory agency. I think there's a
Absolutely.
lot. Yeah, and yeah, so I think that's definitely a big issue that again is existing, but now with how fast things are changing with AI technologies and innovations that has to do with AI, which is I understand, very broad sort of reference. um yeah, we're this is just going to be something that we wrestle with until we can come up with better ways to kind of centralize or um yeah, yeah, so I think there's a lot of room basically for us to um connect different groups that are innovating with the people who are trying to make sure that the impact on humanity is, you know more beneficial than harmful. So
Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, a related issue is
Yeah.
one that's been brought up by, so have you heard of the effective accelerationist movement, for example? You've
Yeah.
heard of them.
Yeah.
So one concern, it's not
hmm
specific to them, but it's also
Yeah.
specific to, in general, those who are technologically more optimistic about these technologies that are
hmm
concerned that if we, if governments and corporations, but especially governments, um, impose overly specific or the wrong regulations too early,
hmm
that they'll stick around and cause more harm than good. What what's your take on that point of view? To what degree do you think it's true? Is there anything to be done about that?
Yeah, I feel like in the way that's just it's just so difficult when with these broad statements there because there's areas that I think it's like, we um that innovation and experimentation is important, but if there are results that we are seeing that is um damaging, I think it really, I mean, goes back to that same that original issue, which is just like, how do we discuss our values and prioritize them, and like the trade-offs we're willing to accept? Because
Okay.
like, yeah, yeah, because ultimately that's a like a societal decision, and then like what trade-offs, what costs are we willing to accept, for the benefits. Ultimately, I think it comes down to that again. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So another issue that I know that you believe isn't talked about enough
Mm.
is the imbalance of power between governments and tech companies. What are your thoughts on that? Why is it that you think that that isn't thought about enough, and what should we be thinking about in that space?
Yeah, I think we've been there's been a lot of back and forth about having the government accelerate their rulemaking and um, catching up to the pace of technology. But I think one of the things that is also happening is that technology companies also are more and more valuable for the government because now the government need a lot of these new innovations for national, international security reasons, international relations, our economic growth. So, these are the things that are also kind of being that are being considered, you know, um, while they're regulating technology companies. And in a way, it's like it used to be that the top technologies came from the government labs, government funded labs. That's no longer the case. The government's like just barely keeping up, trying to understand what is being invented out there and what it could be
Hmm.
used for. Um, so I think my concern there, sort of, from a citizen's perspective and from a sort of more societal well-being perspective, is like, you know, uh, how do we actually, and especially when the government is, I think, losing a lot of trust from society and the general public because of all these political debates and because of the cultural divide. So not even because of solely technology issues, but for various other reasons. Um, when the public is losing faith in the government, and the government no longer has as much control over um, technology, how um, it's they're losing the ability to kind of justify why they're putting regulations on the companies, and then the companies of course like have uh, there are important factors to consider, right, which is what you just mentioned, which is like, but we want to innovate, we want to solve these issues with technology. Yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a peculiar dynamic. As you mentioned, there's
Yeah.
race dynamics, the competitive race dynamics between great powers and even middle powers to have their piece of the pie when it comes to all of the spoils of development in technology and specifically AI, but across the board. And then you have the companies themselves, which have the silent threat that if you overregulate us, we won't be able to help you win the race. Um, and then you have, yeah, you have a lot of really interesting dynamics there. Beyond that, you also have the interesting dynamic that AI is both increasing and decreasing power asymmetries at the same time. So, a really pertinent example is the war in Ukraine, the
Hmm.
Russian invasion of Ukraine,
Yeah.
where the use of AI and robotics has brought the cost of weaponry down for both sides and produced some really bizarre dynamics in terms of where the power symmetry falls relative to spending. Um, and what you're also seeing is AI being that was developed in countries like the United States being deployed often with their open source variants or sometimes even the paid versions in countries that had nothing to do with the development and used by their own governments or political parties for their own purposes, or even non-governmental and terrorist groups for everything from political and campaigns. Like in Indonesia, I know that there's a political campaign going on with one of the not so nice guys from the dictatorship using a cute image of himself that was generated in Mid-Journey for his political campaign, and he's
Hmm.
currently scoring higher than anyone else
Yeah.
because of this.
Hmm.
Like, to yeah, to the fact that many of these tools can be used for um, surveillance, can be used to scale bot farms for political influence campaigns or government influence campaigns. Uh, yeah,
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
weird situation.
Yeah, I think that's a, really great summary and great points that you mentioned, which is just like a lot of these dynamics of how we, think about um, whether it's like campaigning or international relations or how wars fought, the dynamics of it is changing. And then the results of how the dynamics are changing is like unexpected, because we're applying our creativity, human creativity to these contexts in different ways. And I think and then another dynamic of it is just like, these new technologies have brought have drawn a lot of, market interest to these tech companies. So now, the whether it's like speculative or projected, value of these companies has just like, skyrocketed, so the existing concerns about, companies being able to, fund and lobby governments and things like that. I think that doesn't help. But again, it's not that I don't think that we know exactly what all the dynamics are. And I think there is a lot to study there. And which is like, I do find that um, this is kind of an environment where, so the social sciences is like even more needed, to study all the effects of this and to like inform the people building technology, creating policy, like what are the new dynamics now, and it's just evolving so quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We're going to I think
Hmm.
we're going to come back to that issue. But
Hmm.
another issue that's come up has been, and you brought this up earlier as well, was the speed of development and how quickly these changes are occurring. Do you think that the legal regulation process and frameworks that we currently have are equipped to deal with that?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. And I think almost like people are um, almost overly reliant on this. It's almost kind of like a, you know, um, overly reliant. And what I mean by that is um, like in many ways, like we're not looking, and I'm just, giving an example here. Like we're not looking for the government to regulate how often we use our phones, right? Or like how
Sure.
often we're on social media. Like we don't even really necessarily want to be the person policing our kids and how often they're on social media, right? So it's like on the one hand, like legal and regulatory governance is very important, but then I think it's like there's a lot about like how does our culture, like our individual culture, like need to adjust, and how does our sort of like collective culture needs to adjust to the changes that AI technologies are bringing, so it's like and these some of these are naturally occurring, and some of this happens like, after we're like, oh my God, I'm so sick of staring at my phone, I need to go on a tech diet for, like 10 days, right? It's like that
Mhm.
didn't used to happen when we didn't have phones, right? And so there's a mix of that where I think like for us to for us, human beings to live well, yes, the legal regulatory governance is important, and then to some extent it's like, you know um and this is why I think also social sciences and sort of a looking at AI ethics as from a perspective of living well is important, is like some of it is like how do we adapt to the new context, to the new environment, is not, fully about like the legal and the regulatory. But
Sure.
knowing what the effects are, it's like, now we have study on the modern epidemic of loneliness, having um, um, uh, things like that, help us understand, like, yeah, how is society changing? How are lives changing from, you know, previous generations, and how do we as, people adapt to that,
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or that
Well,
addressed your question.
it
Yeah,
does start getting to it. I think that
yeah.
there are a few points. One of them
Hmm.
is that the examples of the government directly getting involved with how much screen time you have is an interesting
Hmm.
one because
Hmm.
the People's Republic of China has gotten into that game.
Right,
And
right.
right, so
Yes. And
yeah,
this is where like it comes back to that point again, of like as a society, us deciding on what do we value, and then like
mhm,
what are the trade-offs we're willing to accept.
right,
So yeah. Yeah, and
yeah,
and actually it's interesting because I was just reading that in the UK they just recently decided to um ban use of electronic devices for kids in schools. Like the
yeah,
UK just said, kids, no devices in school at all, even on breaks. But if you did
yeah.
that in the US, right? So that could be really difficult, you know, um, uh,
Well, I'm
you
sure
know,
it's difficult in the UK too, but
well, yeah, yeah, but then
but
it's actually done. But I mean, like here, like even
mhm,
if you did it statewide, I think it could be, I think that in terms of like how Americans value our individual freedom of choice. So I'm saying like,
mhm,
yeah, the ethics and the policy really needs to be considered with, within this larger context of like what are the culture's values,
mhm,
politics of the people that are answering, the specific ethics and policy issues. Yeah.
mhm. Well, so that gets close to what may be some of the more immediate
Mhm.
um, policy topics that we may be able to approach. Is if you're talking about the equilibrium and trade-offs when it comes to individual choice, there are several past regulations that weren't for AI that I think are widely popular in many countries,
Mhm.
which would include government regulation of labeling of food, for example. Um, and in this case, this has to do with choice, in that it doesn't restrict consumers' choice of what products they buy. It gives them tools to be informed. Um, if we talk about that in the context of technology, of devices, but also software and AI, that has some implications for what kinds of regulations we might see that might be popular in a country like the United States. Um, are there have you come across any policy recommendations that made you feel excited or clicked and said, that looks like it might work? Or is it still very much feel like everything that's been put on the table is in a wishy-washy state of we still really don't know enough to do anything?
Mm, yeah, it's just been such a mix, because there's definitely sort of broader frameworks that's meant to apply more generally, and those are going to be um, will need to be able to encapsulate,
Mhm.
uh, and then there's like, very specific regulation or policy recommendation targeting very specific things. Um, so I don't know if I can answer that directly, but one thing that I did want to mention when you were talking about like individual freedoms is I think another difficulty with some of the things, some of the ethical issues that might come up is that some of the effects is more latent. Or and what I mean by that is like, for example, it's like, how do we think about persuasiveness and persuasion? So when a generative LLM, for example, is, or yeah, LLM is trying to give advice or recommendation, when is it unethically persuasive? Like, where do we draw
Yeah.
the line with that? Or even it's like Of course, there's been like talks about like deep fake videos, but then also shallow fake, which is like when you just make an image appear a little bit more, say Biden appear a little older, you
Hmm.
know, or so and so they just appear prettier or like
Hmm.
more
Eyes are
trustworthy.
bigger,
They
yeah,
have, yeah, they have a
whatever it is.
look that's like more trustworthy,
Hmm.
to sell you some product or sell you some services. Like some of the things are a little bit more latent like this. So it's like, and they might disclose, okay, we're giving you this advice and this recommendation, but we're not a licensed, XYZ. But we don't, how we don't really know like how is that enough? Like a disclaimer enough in, a variety of situations. Um, and again, it's just
So
like
yeah,
how do you define what
mhm.
ethical persuasiveness is, so I think we have a lot
Yeah,
of interesting topics. Yeah.
right. So so that gets to a
Yeah.
kind of interesting point. When you talk about persuasiveness, it's not
Yeah.
necessarily the like in the examples you gave of
Mm,
shallow fakes. Um,
mm,
that's not significantly different from technologies that have been available for decades. You know,
mm,
with lighting techniques, makeup, um, and any number of good old fashioned media tricks can do similar things, making someone appear more attractive, or just by splicing and choosing specific footage, we can make someone look less attractive, or what have you.
yeah.
It seems like the difference is the predictive modeling, statistical modeling, some of the stuff that has to do with how we're judging whether something we're putting out in the world is changing public behavior. So so how does how do we deal with that on a regulatory level? Because like it seems like the danger to me would be that we decide to put labels on videos that have been altered by AI when that's not actually the thing that's most worrisome. The most worrisome thing is persuasiveness by choice rather than persuasiveness by alteration.
Say the persuasiveness by choice again.
Well, so this is where I'm specifically saying that the
Mm,
type of video that you're putting out, let's say that you're doing an ad campaign for a political
mm,
candidate, has been
yeah.
chosen by an AI model or a statistical model um, of some type, where it's effectively um, pushing the the population level profile in a targeted, mathematically rigorous way. It's very different from human intuition, and that in some ways may be more effective in a shallow sense. Um, and that may be more like I guess where I'm coming from is how do you disclose that? How do you disclose work like Cambridge Analytica, which is this has been with us for a while? Um, yeah, that's what I'm
Yeah,
getting at.
yeah, and it seems to me like what you're describing is like when we know what the effect will be. Like, you might go in and like try to look like an expert or look more professional or look more trustworthy by doing these things. But then it's like
Hmm.
even though you might try, it's like you don't really know what the effect is. And then it's
Hmm.
like with technology, it's like you can predict, like there's some way that that this is the button to push. And then so it's like, okay, knowingly doing that, and it reminds me of some of this like online social media. It's like knowing when you know what the results would be and doing that,
Hmm.
so I feel like there's like that coupling. Um, so I mean, I kind of feel like I'm going back, because it's like it's not so much because we all have personal opinions on this, and then I think ultimately it's like what is really important is really like societally being able to kind of decide on some of these issues and then actually getting the representation we want in government to make the appropriate rulemaking or whatnot or guidelines in order to like affect the behavior of companies that are producing the technology. So that's kind of how I'm seeing it. Yeah.
Okay. Hmm. I'm trying to think of where to go with this next. But
Yeah.
something that you mentioned before was the loneliness epidemic. Before
Mhm.
this call, you shared kind of a list of topics you wanted to talk about and a little bit about
Yeah.
them. And you said that the loneliness epidemic was not just due to what was it? It was not just due to social media and some of the commonly stated causes, but more general social changes that have happened over the past couple of decades and life in the city, and it's multi-causal.
Yeah.
So how do you see AI on its current trajectory influencing the loneliness epidemic? And what would an alternative look like that may, how could we maybe make it better?
Hmm. Yeah. Loneliness pandemic. I think this is an
The
area
loneliness
where like I could,
pandemic.
yeah, loneliness pandemic,
Epidemic.
epidemic. Um,
Yeah.
where AI could have like both positive effects and negative effects, in terms of like how does it, and this is an area that I'm quite interested in seeing, it's like how does interacting with more whether it's LLMs or AI technology based agents, how does that change our way of interacting with other human beings, and in a way it's like there's there's a lot of ways that I think it could change the larger social fabric that we're living in, which is, I think, OpenAI came out with this teaser for Sora recently, and it's just, you can generate, very realistic videos just based on a very short, text prompts and we kind of have known that something like that is coming and works. And so, what is it like when you're scrolling through social media or reading content and you are asking yourself constantly, or you just kind of have a sense in the back of your mind that maybe none of it is true? Like, how does that change our psychology, and how does that change our view of the world? It's like we just don't know, you know. Um, and like when we have all these technologies to help us generate a different reality, whether it's like a fantasy or whatever reality of someone else that we want to understand, and we can increase our experience of that, what are all the different implications of that? So I think there's like,
Yeah.
it could be used, great, it could generate very empathetic humans, right?
Yeah.
Where we actually have better ability to understand someone else with a different reality,
Yeah.
where we are less tied to, you know, uh, um, XYZ must only be done and seen this one way. So that could happen. And we could also have a lot of humans who are very lost because it's like, what is the truth? And this person who has a different belief than me, like maybe they're just ingesting all the fake news and I'm ingesting all the non-fake news. And we've already seen that happen,
Yes.
without before generative AI became so popular. So that could it could with LLMs now, it could both like worsen and it could also get better. um
Yeah.
and I
Well,
think that
like,
is I think that is really important issue too, that we're not really talking about in um is like, how do we um there is some talks of having the tech companies and the social media platforms like label content if it's AI generated, and of course monitoring for anything that might look like misinformation, disinformation. But
mhm.
how are we actually helping the humans that are susceptible to these things like become more immune?
Yeah.
And yeah, so a lot of and then it's like when populations become fragmented about it, what do we actively do about it?
Yes.
We're just like, let's give them more better information, but like, that hasn't completely helped, that yeah. So that hasn't resolved the problem yet. Yeah,
No, no, it has not.
yeah.
And it does raise a few interesting
Mm,
points. Like one of them is like if we're talking about policies that seem generally popular with regards to
mm,
AI, labeling is one that people generally give a big thumbs up to and say, yes, that sounds great. Let's label AI content. I think because it has the analogous purpose of previous regulations people liked, like labeling food, it's
mm.
pretty easy to agree to. And as you say, maybe it doesn't actually make a big difference. If the bigger problem is um, like having convinced siloed people who end up in bubbles that are created by social media. Um, is there? Hmm, I guess you probably don't know the answer to this one because who knows? But do you see it being possible to use either regulation or technology or both to counteract this the siloing that people tend to get into today with social media and certain social groups.
Yeah, I think I think it's very possible that both of those, I think that's an area I feel like isn't being focused on enough yet.
Hmm.
I think in terms of like how do we um use all the things that we've learned about affecting human beings, and then how do we get them out of a silo? I think that's been, I mean, yeah, these are definitely uh sort of more specific issues that I feel like they're social scientists, social science experts that are like focus on these issues. Like, why do people who might have been very avid followers of QAnon, like, how do they then change their beliefs 180? And I think that's just something that we're still in the very beginnings of like understanding. Yeah,
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 yeah, that's fairly interesting. I'm looking at time, so we're still
yeah.
okay. So I wanted to talk. Let's talk maybe a little bit about what you're doing right now. What is it that you are doing out in the world with regard to AI and
Yeah,
community
so
building,
yeah, so one of the
etc.?
things I'm starting to look at is uh, you know, what kind of social science issue or sort of knowledge areas isn't being shared enough yet in the sort of like more tech policy or tech ethics world. Um, and then I think part of my explorations have been um, understanding sort of in a way like um, thinking about what are sort of experiences that we are forgetting, um, and how do we kind of recapture those experiences. So I think, and um, that's it's kind of hard to explain how this connects to the AI ethics and AI policy side of things, but um, let me see how. Um,
Well,
yeah.
last episode
Mm,
we had a guest named B. Scott,
mm,
and the area that he came into AI through was Heideggerian philosophy.
yeah.
Originally, like his Hubert Dreyfus was one of his teachers who
Hmm.
used a lot of Heidegger, and Heidegger has all these sort of senses of like how we are in the world as human beings, and um, the ways in which technology, and that would include AI, can interfere with or damage or cheapen that sort of experience potentially may be related to what
Yeah,
you're
that's
talking about.
actually, yeah, that's a great point. Because I watched that episode and that was really fascinating, and I had some thoughts on that, which is, I think one of the most, one of the reasons that I'm so interested in AI, because I think it really is a mirror that helps us, uh, just reflect more on what it is that humans are and humans do. So I think, you guys had talked about like what is language, and uh, and talked about language as sort of like some sort of commitment to some sort of action,
Hmm.
and I think, it's really that aspect of AI that I find really fascinating on a personal level, which is just um, um, thinking about, with certain friends that we know, like there might be, we might call them something horrible, right? And then that might be one of the most endearing terms, that they have in calling you, So it's like there's ways that I feel like, AI has allowed us to kind of like examine what does it mean, you know, and I think this is kind of playing out in LLMs as well, which is just like what are kind of the terms and you aren't supposed to use, right? That are like censored and banned and things like that. And what
Hmm.
does that say about our values and our principles? Um, and also it's like, yeah, so yeah, I'm kind of like
Yeah,
forgetting the thread a
no,
little bit.
no, it's okay. I think we can dance around this thread because it's an interesting one. So, like, one trend that I've noticed, like when I use GPT for
Yeah.
other large language models, interacting with them is really fascinating to me because I notice how a real human uses language in 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 the delta, right?
Mhm.
That I'll get a response and it may be informative, it may be confabulated, it may feel like it has emotional content, but it fundamentally doesn't feel like the kind of interaction you and I are having. And uh, as as this technology continues to progress, it's pretty easy to see without any special technological leaps that I might be talking to a multimodal model right now, hypothetically. I mean, we're just using a computer screen to talk. I could be a simulation, you could be a simulation talking through a large language model that simulates my speech patterns or yours or makes them up whole cloth. And how would you know? And what would it feel like to interact with that sort of entity that isn't conscious, which doesn't really have any being in the world? Um,
Yeah, and I think
yeah,
it leads us to like, interesting moral questions in terms of like, and that's like what, going back to the movie Her, right? Which is if
yeah,
I feel the experience of love, but the being or the object that I'm having talking to might be capable or not capable, we don't know, right? But
mhm,
if I'm having the experience of love, is that all that matters?
yeah,
And
yeah. You get this.
yeah.
There's an analog to the visual arts where if you go into a museum and you see a painting, that painting or a tapestry or whatever it
Mhm.
is, and
Right.
you have an experience of that, it's an inanimate object. Like the
Yes.
person and there's also a
Hmm.
fundamental divide between the
Hmm.
intent of the artist or whatever they were feeling when they created it,
Yes.
and that is cut off. It's put on the wall, and then you have your own experience that's reflected back at you. And um, yeah, there's something similar to that going on, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I know we're, branching off into more esoteric topics, but also, related to that is we're talking about what was it? Yeah, the internal experience. And then, I think there's a lot of concern right now about like anthropomorphization. And it that's, is also field I think that's we're gonna get, much deeper in. And there are ways that because we anthropomorphize, right, AI technologies, that we might be, that might create some blind spot in understanding how it actually works and et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
But to a certain extent, it's like we can only kind of understand something else from the human experience.
Hmm.
So in a way, it's like, that tendency, like we can, AI becoming sentient, how do we become, whether something that can actually understand, sentient I think that's a, very interesting topic as well. It's like how can we become something that understands sentient AI when it's like, out of a solely human being, and then so I think, and I think what you just mentioned is just like our understanding of animate and inanimate objects,
Hmm.
that there's some, great content written about this. um but yeah, to the extent that, AI agents start to understand, and again, it's like, what do we mean by understand what they're intending to do and actually accomplishing what they're intending to do? Does that make them more an, animate thing, animate, being as opposed to person? How do we draw those lines? And it's
Yeah.
like yeah, it's just, um,
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that's going to be very confusing,
yeah,
I think, for quite a while, is
mm,
that um, we're probably going to get AI agents, as you
yeah,
say, these
yeah,
that are autonomously doing their thing, and that yeah, that are actually self-correcting enough and stable enough that they're able to continue doing that thing without supervision. And that thing may be having a conversation, like in her example, or the simulated me example. Um, and at the same time, for if they're built on the technology that exists right now, that we can imagine a few years from now, same algorithms, same techniques, there's very little reason to suspect. Like we can probably say they don't have any interior experience. They're able to simulate having a conversation really effectively, but they're not really having. There's no
yeah,
there.
mm,
Um, and so then that kind of ties back to this whole analogy with art and other objects that we create for our as tools or for our pleasure or for any number of things in the world, and how do we relate to them, and are they really serving us? um, and that gets back to like the previous conversation in Heidegger and stuff, because then you start
mhm,
asking questions of, well, to what extent should the tool replace some other experience, like talking to a real person,
mhm.
or going to a real concert with musicians, or what have you.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And sort of more general questions that I wonder about, not necessarily, strictly on AI ethics or AI policy, are just like, when we are surrounded by these like beautiful images and even the ugly, images and the horrible, terrifying images generated by AI, like has this sort of like quality of perfection to it. For
mhm,
example, it's like, how does that, change, kind of, again, it's like more latent relationship that we have towards like perfectionism, or when it's
mhm,
so easy for these like beautiful things or amazing things, objects or images or like results to be created. It's so easy. How
mhm,
does it drive us to be, again, like a more results oriented society as opposed to a process oriented society? And then I think, and then there are ways that we are kind of have become a society that's very reliant on um, um, not direct information, but like second-handed and third-handed information. Like, we're not just like living our day, like going out, plant the food, come back, harvest the food, cook the food, it's
Yeah,
like we're like, oh, what are the financial markets? And the financial markets is like a bunch of information gathered and represented in all these ways. Um, so and then it's like we're in current society like losing touch with sort of with the somatic, with direct experience. And then so you have a lot of people, I think, in these tech communities, right, that are like driven to you know uh be without the phone for 10 days, go to a yoga retreat where all you do is like be in your body. There's these like very interesting effects um, that is changing again. It's like how we live as humans. So I'm really
yeah,
interested in those aspects as well.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, you brought up some interesting points, and they bring to mind things that have already happened, or changes that have already occurred in our
Mm,
society. So when
yeah.
you talk about generated content and how it has this unreal or over beautiful quality to it many times, um, I mean, one of the responses that I would have to that is that reflects not so much something fundamental about this, like the architecture of the system, but a lot more about the value preferences of the people creating those systems in really weird ways that aren't fully examined. Um, if we look at how that's played out in the past with prior to AI, I mean, you can look at glossy magazines, television, movies, um, and you can point to a lot of really negative things that happened, like the rise in body dysmorphia and bulimia, other disorders that can be tied directly to these altered, very selected images of what beauty is. So yeah, when a lot of aspects of the world become artificial um, and don't resemble um, that are overly perfect, whether it be language or the image or sound, um, that obviously has some distorting effect on what we perceive as better or worse, or right or wrong, or beautiful, not beautiful.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and we still have a choice, like when we're creating these technologies, about how do they distribute the image, how do they portray music, how do they um, depict people?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Very interesting.
on
And I guess, yeah, I am curious, like, and what do you think about, when you think AI ethics? I know we've kind of like touched on different aspects of it, but I'm curious, for you, what do you think about when someone says responsible tech or
Yeah,
ethical
what I think
AI?
about, it
Yeah.
almost always boils down to externalities for me, like some way of
Mm,
framing it as an externality, some sort of way in which it is um, secretly doing a harm that isn't caught, measured, or cared about
hmm
by the people who are creating it. So it may be like in popular culture that that's something
mm,
people are aware of. I don't think that it's always talked about fully coherently, but you may talk about something like how much of a person's day they end up spending on a phone. And that for me has ethical implications. How much time do they end up spending talking to a chatbot instead of the people around them? Or how does it change the way we speak to the people around us or interact with the people around us? That has ethical implications. There are
yes.
other things like there is an ethics to that goes beyond AI, just in general, the technosphere of
hmm
damage to the planet, um, that or like you know ways in which sound pollution, light pollution, chemical pollution, air pollution, destruction of land isn't really reckoned into the price of things. Um, when really that's part of the commons that we should all care about, and it's basically being taken from us, or we're
Yeah.
taking it from ourselves in many cases. Um, uh, that's like the scope of ethics for me. It's just all
Mm.
these unmeasured and uncared about ways in which we're harming people in the world.
Yeah, I
Um,
like that. Yeah. Yeah, because I
yeah,
find that and this is um uh, uh, a point I like to mention as well, which is I feel like, these definitions are kind of will continue to change, but there's also kind of I feel like there was a sort of like rush to kind of define what AI ethics is and responsible ethics, so that like,
hmm,
there is some sort of standard that we could measure by. And then,
yeah,
but some of that is losing kind of the larger and more nuanced discussion of all the ways that ethics can show up. So, or
yeah,
even just, I think, terms like trust, are ones that's we're gonna have like different waves of, terms pop up that then like either gets diluted or like become like
yeah. That
10 different meanings, so
Yeah,
yeah,
that seems very true to me. Or like even some
yeah,
of the more subtle things that we were talking about are understood by the people building the tools, but then implemented in ways that don't really live up to the more nuanced version of it. Um, I think like one of the funny examples is that's been going on for years has been that many of the learning models that we've been developing magnify biases that exist in the training set. So, um, I mean, like the most political hot button issue in the U.S. is racial bias, but they'll blow up bias according to um, by gender or bias along other axes that we may not be tracking politically. And the solution to that for products that are being released out in the wild more
mhm,
recently has been to try to slap on an additional layer that corrects for it in one way or another. And recently, when Google released um, their latest image generation model with Gemini,
I saw that.
that layer that the layer that they slapped on inverted the bias that they were
Right.
specific and only biases that they cared about. So
Mhm.
it would all, yeah. So that's sort of a funny one. So it very much it was sensitive to the things that it learned from probably reinforcement learning with human feedback and also some very specific text filters. And the results for certain results were funny, but um, but that's an instance where like the lack of subtlety or lack of understanding of the problem just manifests as absurd. And there are other ways in which it can um, manifest as maybe not so good. So, for example, like they were filtering for with a good goal of trying to have the output set reflect more diversity, and then the way it implemented didn't work the way they wanted it to. And then the other thing was they were not filtering for other types of diversity necessarily that they might have wanted to care about. You know,
Mhm.
um,
Right.
it's very likely to produce beautiful, perfect-looking people, regardless of their race, right?
Yeah.
And that's a
Yeah.
bias. That is
Yeah.
absolutely a bias.
Right.
Um, and beautiful is in the eye of the beholder. So it's like when I say beautiful, it's like there's a specific meaning that has that isn't really beauty. Um, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
or even, like when they generated like the normal, the average person in XYZ state, there's
oh
just so many
yeah.
ways um that's really funny to see sort of like AI reflecting back what it thinks the world is to us, based on yeah.
Hmm.
Um
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah. Very funny stuff. Yeah.
yeah, and I think another kind of issue that we'll have to continue to wrestle with is, the like the people who are creating the technology, and again, like the people who are implementing the policy, may be on different layers of the organization. So
Oh
even
yeah.
just sort of like who's deciding on where and what data to use, and just the engineer who might be, actually using data training and et cetera, like um, I don't know if that's gotten more yeah, just in terms of like I think tech companies having to balance like um like the engineers care about the results of our work, but we also need to like, create the product and get it out the door, things like that. So coordinating uh, within a company, how to implement, policies and ethics. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm,
that's an entire can of worms we probably don't have
mm,
time to talk about.
yeah.
because, but
Mm,
yeah, some of the things that are worth thinking about that go beyond government policy are like transparency, corporate policy, and accountability.
mm,
I mean, we saw this already happen with the whole scandal at OpenAI when um, Sam Altman was ousted as CEO and then came right back.
mm.
Um, that even when there's a structure that's designed to have some sort of ethical accountability, it's often broken almost immediately by the financial model of the company. Um, and for many companies, at the end of the day, many of their ethical um, concerns are driven as much, if not more, by what they believe the effect will be on their stock price than what individual opinions about what right and wrong may be within the company. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and I find that that is, definitely something that we'll probably see a lot more, have to wrestle much more with, which is just like even with the kind of like scandalizing, Senate hearing over like Meta and like um um uh, you know uh uh all that whether I'm trying to summarize it, just the Facebook being a place for potential like sexual abuse or exploitation.
yeah,
There was this horrible Senate committee hearing, but the stock price of Facebook has been, growing well. So, that kind of mismatch, I feel like is not a helpful signal. Um, but then again, it's like it could be interpreted so many ways, but in a way it's kind of it's like how do we align, right? Ultimately, it's like how do we align these different aspects of our society to incentivize, yeah, better use of technology. So,
yeah. Um, we're at time, and I think that's
mm,
really the ultimate question
yeah,
that doesn't quite have an answer. How do we align
yeah, mm,
our activities and AI development with what we really want as a society, like collectively, individually, at every level? It's an impossible problem we have to solve.
yes, yes.
Do you have any closing remarks or thoughts or things you want to leave the audience with today?
No,
All right, that's
yeah,
perfectly good.
okay.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today, Christina.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
All right, it has been AI Salon. Thank you.